This week, the story that we'll be covering is concerning Jacob's dream at Bethel. And so like Manny said last week, we covered the story concerning how Jacob first stole Esau's birthright from him, selling him a bowl of stew for it. And then this week we see that Jacob, he continues on in his supplanting ways, right? In fact, that's what his very name means. Jacob's name means heel holder or heel grabber, meaning that he's a supplanter, that he's always trying to, get ahead of other people, even his own brother from when he was in the womb. And so this time, though, I think we're all somewhat familiar with this story. The account leads in with Jacob, this time not only deceiving his brother Esau, but even his own father, his own blind father, in order to steal the blessing that should have been Esau's. And so we see then that, and so I'm sure you all are somewhat familiar with the story, but I'll just recap it real quickly for you. And so Isaac says to his older son Esau, I want to bless you, so go forth and go hunt some game, and then prepare a tasty meal according to the way I like it, and then bring it to me, and then I'll bless you before I die. And so then Esau, he takes his bow, and then he goes out to hunt game. And then while Esau is away, Rebekah, their mother, hears about this, and she, liking Jacob more, tells Jacob, okay, so here's what you're going to do. I'm going to prepare this tasty meal according to how your father Isaac likes it. And then you're going to put on your brother's clothes and also cover your arms and your neck in sheepskin so that you feel hairy like your brother is. And so then you can go in and bring this meal to your father and then take the blessing from him. And so Jacob, being a good son who listens to his mother, followed his mother's instructions and then also stole the blessing that should have been Esau's. And then Esau, he comes back and he hears about this and he decides, okay, as soon as my father dies, I'm going to kill Jacob. So things are going really well in the family right now. And so Jacob, to avoid being killed by his brother, he follows his parents' orders and he leaves home. He leaves home to go to his uncle Laban. So he leaves home to go from the land of Canaan across several hundred miles all the way over to where Laban is in Mesopotamia, back where Abraham originally came from. And so in that time, especially, this is a crazy journey, right? Jacob, he has to leave everything that he knows and just travel homelessly in order to undertake this crazy journey across several hundred miles. And keep in mind, there were no cars then. There weren't even horses then, I don't think. And so he had to do this whole journey on foot. So I'm sure you can imagine how crazy this is. And so this leads us to today's story, where while Jacob is traveling through the wilderness, he stops at a certain place to rest. And so he lies down to sleep for the night with a stone as his pillow in the wilderness. And in this place, he has a dream. And this dream, we'll see, consists of three main items. But mainly, I just want to impress you guys with the fact that of how amazing this dream is. Because this dream, actually, we'll see, is not only another instance where Christ is revealed to us in the Old Testament, but it's actually the first revelation concerning the church, the house of God in the Bible. And so this dream is really amazing. And so let's get into the verses and we'll see what these three items in the dream are. And so I will share my screen. And so here's our topic, the dream at Bethel. Okay. And so here are our first three verses, Genesis 28, 10 through 12. And so could I get a couple people from the audience to maybe read through these verses? Maybe, how about Lauren, would you mind reading through verses 10 and 11? And then maybe I can get Jasper to read verse 12. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay. And Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and spent the night there, because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head, and he lay down in that place.
And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven. And there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much. And so we see here that the fugitive Jacob, he is resting in this place and he has this dream. And this is the first item in the dream is this heavenly ladder, you can call it. This is item number 1, right? With the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And now we come to the verses that show us the second item in the dream. And so there's kind of a lot going on here, so I'll just walk through the verses real quickly. We see here that the next part of the dream is that God actually speaks to Jacob directly in the dream. And he says to Jacob, I am Jehovah, the God of Abraham, right? The God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your seed. And then he goes on to say, and in you and in your seed will all the families of the earth be blessed. Does this promise sound familiar to any of you guys? It should, because this is actually the exact same promise that God spoke to Abraham. And so he speaks it again. He reiterates this set of promises to Jacob as he's in the wilderness. And so this is the second item that we see in the dream, that this reiteration of the promise to Abraham. And then finally, we come to the last set of verses, which contains item number 3. And so could I get a few more people to maybe read through these verses? Let's see. How about Phoebe, would you mind reading through verses 16 and 17? And then could I get Bola, please, to read verse 19?
Genesis 28:16. And Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely Jehovah is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? There is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven.
Genesis 28:19. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz previously.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, and so we see here the third item in Jacob's dream, which is the house of God, right? And so Jacob, he has a realization concerning the house of God issuing from this dream that he has. And so he calls the name of the place that he's in Bethel, which in Hebrew is actually 2 words, Beth, meaning house of, and El, meaning God. Wow. And so let's recap real quickly again. The episode of the dream at Bethel can then be summarized in 3 main items. So first, there's the heavenly ladder with the angels ascending and descending. And then there's the promise to Abraham reiterated, right? And then finally, there is the house of God. And so the significance of these 3 items, let's walk through each of them and see if we can unpack the meaning of these 3 items as revealed in the rest of the Bible. And so actually we see here that, and so the first item that we'll come to is the heavenly ladder. And so in Genesis 28:12, this heavenly ladder is described with the phrase, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And something I want to point out to you guys is that this phrase only appears in one other instance in the entire Bible. And that's in John 1:51, where Jesus says regarding himself, you shall see heaven open and the Son and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And so these verses show us so clearly that actually Christ is the real heavenly ladder. That this heavenly ladder that Jacob sees here is a picture depicting the Christ who God has already prepared for mankind, even at this point. Christ is the real heavenly ladder, connecting heaven to earth and God to man. So this is another wonderful instance where we see Christ all the way early, even this early on in the book of Genesis. And then coming to the second item, let's talk about the significance of God reiterating this promise to Abraham. And so in previous weeks, something that we've established is that the seed that God promises to Abraham refers to Christ. And that actually everything God did in the Old Testament was so that Christ could come forth in Judea, in the right place at the right time. And this is seen in Galatians 3:16, right? But to Abraham, when the promise is spoken, he does not say, and to the seeds as concerning many, but as concerning one, and to your seed, who is Christ. This shows us so clearly that the seed that God promised to Abraham is actually referring to Jesus. And then we also see, likewise, that everything God is doing in the New Testament time, which we're currently in, is so that Christ can be formed in us. And this is seen in Galatians 4:19, where Paul, he writes, "My children with whom I travail again in birth, until Christ is formed in you, students, in me, in all of us." Isn't this wonderful? This is the purpose of everything that God is doing today in the New Testament age. And this is one of my favorite verses from the entire Bible. This is 2 Peter 1:4, which tells us the purpose, actually, of all of the promises that God gives to us in the Bible. It says that God, he has granted to us precious and exceedingly great promises, right? For what purpose? That through these, you might become partakers of the divine nature. Wow. And so concerning the significance of promises in the Bible, we need to see that God's promises are not just to meet our needs, but also his need. We see that actually God, he needs not just good people, right? But he needs people who have been transformed to have his nature even. And so then coming to the next section, we'll see just why he needs such people. So let's talk about the significance of the house of God. Before we go on real quickly, I just have a question for everyone here. If I were to ask you where God lives or dwells today, what would your answer be? Just the first thought that comes to mind. Just everybody, just unmute and just shout out whatever the first thing that comes to mind is. Please. Okay. Well, it's I don't know about you guys, but at least for me, my first guess would probably be heaven, right? Like, it just, seems like a reasonable answer, right? And it's, in my experience, at least, it's certainly the most common answer that one would give to this question. But I just want to share a couple verses with you guys from the book of Isaiah. And so this is from Isaiah 66. And so verse 1 says, "Thus says Jehovah, heaven is my throne, and the earth the footstool for my feet. Where then is the house that you will build for me? And where is the place of my rest?" Wow. And so actually, contrary to what may be popular belief, these verses seem to suggest to us that actually the house that God desires is not heaven, right? Heaven is not God's house according to the Bible. Because it says here, heaven is my throne, right? And the earth is the footstool for my feet. Where then is the house that you will build for me? This implies that this house is something that God does not have yet, right? He has heaven already. He has earth already, right? But where then is the house that he wants, that he requires? And if you continue on in verse 2, actually, concerning this house, God actually speaks about a certain type of people. He says, but to this kind of man will I look. Remember, he's talking about his house here. To him who is poor and of a contrite spirit, and who trembles at my word. And so in speaking concerning the house that he desires, God actually doesn't speak concerning a place or a physical building, but of a type of person. And so here we see the aspect of that God's house is actually, he wants to make his home within each of us as individual believers. And the house of God, the house that God is looking for is in people of the kind described at the end of Isaiah 66:2, right? It's to him who is poor and of a contrite spirit and who trembles at my word, right? And this is further confirmed in the New Testament also, in this wonderful verse, John 14:23. It says, if anyone, Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make an abode with him, right? God's desire is not for a physical house or even for just heaven to be his house, but he desires to be able to make his home in us. Wow. And so coming to the next set of verses, then we see, let's see, 1 Peter 2:5 and Ephesians 2:22. Could I get a couple of volunteers also to read these verses for me? Let's see. Maybe Chloe, would you mind reading 1 Peter 2:5? And then maybe I could get James to read Ephesians 2:22. Is that okay? Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. 1 Peter 2:5. You yourselves also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house.
And Ephesians 2:22, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling place of God in spirit.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you, guys. And so these verses actually point out to us the result of God making his home in us, as the earlier verses said. The result is that we become stones. We become stones to be built up into God's house in the corporate aspect. And so God's house is not just of an individual aspect within each of us, but it's also of a corporate aspect concerning all of us being built up together. And so this also kind of gives us the answer to our earlier question of why God needs people who have his nature, right? We all start off like Adam. That's how we're born. That's the condition that we're born into. And Adam, actually, the original Hebrew word Adam is Adon, and it means clay, not stone, but clay. And in Genesis 1, it even says that God formed man from dust. Right? And so this is what we start off as, not as stones fit for God's building, but as clay and dust, not at all strong like stones, but weak like clay and dust. And so I want to take a minute to ask you guys to consider famous buildings that you've seen and heard of in your life, like the Eiffel Tower or the Taj Mahal or the Empire State Building, right? So imagine those buildings. Now, imagine if instead of using fine metals and stone, the architects of those buildings made them out of clay and dust. Not only would these buildings become super fragile, as it doesn't take being an engineering major to figure that out, right? But they also probably wouldn't look very nice, right? In fact, they would look rather ugly, and they would fall far short of expressing the brilliance of the architect, right? And so likewise, God desires a spiritual house, just as the verses said earlier, built of the most glorious spiritual stones. And so he doesn't want us as Christians just to improve or to refine ourselves. You know, if we take a minute to consider our own condition, we'll realize that we're clay, right? And that no amount of improvement or refinement from any amount of our struggling will get us anywhere near what Christ was as the first stone, right? And so, you know, if you try to refine clay, you know, if you fire it in a kiln, it will become hard like stone, and it may seem like stone in some superficial ways, but it will never be strong like stone. Its strength breaks down easily because it doesn't have the nature of stone. And so this is also our condition, right? No amount of us trying to refine ourselves or to improve ourselves will ever make us fit stones for God's building. And so, but I just want to encourage you guys, though, that the situation is not hopeless. And so in Ephesians 2:20, we see that Christ Jesus himself is the cornerstone, right? He's the first stone in God's building, right? The original stone. When you build a building, you lay a cornerstone first. And that the purpose of our becoming partakers of the divine nature is so that we could become what we otherwise can never become. That men of clay like us could become stones like Christ is. Wow, and so Christ is the cornerstone, and God's desire is that we would all be transformed from clay and dust to be like Christ, with the same nature as the cornerstone, to be stones that can be built into God's house. And actually, this corporate house that God is building up has a very, very particular name in the Bible. And the name of this house is the church. 1 Timothy 3:15 says, the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and base of the truth. Wow, isn't this wonderful? And so today, you often hear the word church used maybe in reference to physical buildings, but I hope that from all of the verses we've walked through today, you guys can see so clearly that the church is absolutely not a physical building, right? The original Greek word rendered church in English is this Greek word ekklesia, which means called out assembly. And so the church is the called out assembly of God's people, right? The believers in Christ built together into the house of God, which isn't a physical house, but I hope you guys can see a spiritual house. Isn't this wonderful? And so now we see so clearly that how wonderful the dream that Jacob had was, right? Let's just review real quickly what the three items were from the dream. First, there's the heavenly ladder, right? And then there's the reiteration of the promise to Abraham. And then there's the house of God, these three items, right? And then having walked through all of these points, we also see the relationship between these three items. First, the heavenly ladder reveals Christ, right? And then the promise to Abraham, in that point, we see that God's promises are to make us partakers of the divine nature, to be the same as Christ even. God's promises are not just to meet our needs, but to meet his need so that he can gain stones to be built up into his house, so that we can be transformed from clay to stones for his building. And then finally, thirdly, as stones, right, that he gained from the first 2 points, we can be built up into the church, the house of God that he desires. Isn't this so wonderful? Yeah, this is truly marvelous. And so I'll be wrapping up in just a couple more minutes. But I really want to just impress you guys that in order to see a vision concerning what's on God's heart, we have to be like Jacob in a sense. Not in the sense of him being a schemer or a conniver, but in the sense that in this situation, Jacob had been brought to a point where all of his conniving, his cleverness, all of the effort that he exerted had amounted to nothing, right? Even though he had successfully stolen Esau's birthright and had stolen his blessing, where was he now, right? He was in the wilderness, homeless, kicked out of his house, and he had nothing, right? His pillow was a rock. So he probably had the thought in this situation that nothing he did, none of the work that he had done for himself had actually accomplished any good. And so we also need to have such a realization, right? I just encourage you, do not think that gaining a good degree and a successful career by your own cleverness will accomplish anything. Yes, we need such things. I'm not saying like drop out of school and just give up on all those things, but they're not our ultimate goal, right? We need to see past the things that we are pursuing to see that God is pursuing something, which is his church, his house, and that he is doing everything to build up his house, and that we have the opportunity even to be a part of the church and also a part of this building work. And this is seen in 1 Corinthians 3:10, where Paul, he issues a warning to us. And he's speaking concerning this work of building up the church. He says, according to the grace of God given to me, as a wise master builder, I have laid a foundation, and another builds upon it. But let each man take heed how he builds upon it. And so this shows us that actually each of us, we can be partakers also in this work of building up the church. We're not only stones to be built into the church, but we can also contribute to building up others into this building. And so how can we participate in this work? We can participate in this work by speaking Christ, by ministering him to others, and by preaching the gospel. And I just want to really encourage you guys that you don't have to be a professional missionary or pastor or priest or whatever to do these things. Paul, this charge that he issued was to all of us. And so I just want to encourage you guys, maybe in your next late night study session, after you're all done talking about whatever memes you saw on Instagram that day, or about or commiserating about whatever unreasonable assignment your professor gave to you, maybe after all of that's said and done with your friends, maybe it might seem scary, but you can just speak a little bit concerning Christ to your friends. Speak a little bit concerning how, hey, guys, there's more to just this grind that we are in. There's more to life than just being in this grind that we're currently in. But actually, there's a wonderful God out there who has a wonderful purpose, and that he wants each of us to be a part of this. And so let's all just be before the Lord regarding this matter and present ourselves to be building material and also builders for God's house.